We'll leave it there. Thank you, Bertha Coons. We appreciate it. Now, despite all the dire predictions, I would argue $2 trillion of spending cuts from budget caps in 2011 and this year's budget-cutting sequester. I would argue that all that has functioned like a pro-growth tax cut. It's the best thing we've had. Shrinking the federal government's burden on the private economy is good. The Obama administration wants to end the caps and the sequester, jack up taxes, and spend more on their usual pet projects. Listen to Treasury Secretary Jack Lew on Meet the Press yesterday.
The across-the-board cuts are not good for the economy. They're not good for the American middle class. It's not good for our national defense. We ought to be having a debate about the kinds of medium and long-term reforms to entitlements and tax programs, but we ought not to be talking about holding the country hostage again to a fight over extending the debt limit.
Right here now, two House members, Brad Sherman, Democrat from California, and Steve Scalise, Republican from Louisiana and chair of the Republican Study Committee. Brad Sherman, I'll go to you first. It seems to me that what Mr. Lew wants and what the president wants, get rid of the sequester, get rid of the budget caps, raise taxes, and spend more money. I'm here to tell you it's not going to happen.
Well, I don't think a lot of things being talked at by either party are likely to happen. You're not going to see a defunding of Obamacare. You're unlikely to see the Republicans agree to any revenue increases in the next few months. What I hope we don't see is a default on the debt. And those people who are talking about deliberately defaulting on the American debt are, in the words of McCain, giving us the shenanigans that the American people have gotten tired of.
Steve Scalise, are you in the camp that basically does not want to fund any part of Obamacare and would risk a government shutdown or some kind of default on the debt? Are you in that camp?
Well, Larry, I support full repeal of Obamacare as well as defunding, but the only person talking about defaulting on the debt is President Obama. In fact, we passed the Full Faith and Credit Act to make sure that the government can never default, and the president issued a veto threat on it. So clearly the president wants the threat of default out there to try to scare the American people. But I think that people across the country say, look, families have to live within their means. It's time for government to finally start living within its means and stop borrowing $1 trillion a year with that bill going to our kids and grandkids.
How far would you go, Congressman Scalise, in terms of defunding Obamacare? How far would you go in terms of impinging on the debt limit?
Well, I think if you start with what the president himself acknowledged a few weeks ago, the president recognized that Obamacare is going to be a train wreck, and he said he's willing to delay the employer mandate. Of course, we in the House said, wait a minute, Mr. President, if you think this is so bad that you're going to exempt big businesses, why would you leave American families on the train track and have this train wreck come after them? Individuals should be delayed as well. They shouldn't have to comply with this unworkable law. So I think both the employer mandate and the individual mandate, as well as these exchanges that are not ready for prime time, all need to be on the table because the president himself and his own cabinet secretaries that testify before Congress admit this thing's not ready for prime time come January 1st.
You know, Brad Sherman, just a minute of thought. All right, it's not an Obamacare thought. The fact is, all the dire predictions about the sequester have not really come true. I mean, the economy is not growing. I think it's not growing because of tax threats, because of regulatory threats, because of EPA war on coal, and perhaps because of Obamacare itself. But you know what? I think it's a good thing that spending as a share of GDP has come down. I think the budget caps and I think the sequester have actually helped open up the private sector.
Well, what we see from the CBO, and I'm not talking about Republican talking points or Democratic talking points, the Congressional Budget Office says that our GDP will be 0.7% smaller. That means less, not only less growth now, but less of a GDP for the rest of our lives because of sequester, and that we would have 1.6 million additional jobs if we didn't have sequester. Now, I agree that in the longer term, by the time bald guys like myself start retiring, we're going to need to deal with the entitlements issue. We're going to need to deal with the revenue issue. But short term and medium term, we've got to get this economy going. And giving up on 1.6 million jobs, according to the CBO, that strikes me as a bad approach.
Well, so far the CBO has said that we'd lose 700,000 jobs, but we're not. We're actually picking up a couple 100,000 jobs each month. But let me just go deeper on this. The battle is going to be joined because the president wants things that the House Republicans, Brad Sherman, will not give him. You know it, and I know it. The sequester is going to stay in place. There is no question. There is not going to be a $1 trillion tax cut, as Senator Harry Reid suggested the other day. We've already had a $600 billion tax cut. In other words, those are not negotiating positions. Those are just political positions. What happened to the negotiations, Brad Sherman? How are we going to solve this if Mr. Obama wants something that he knows he can't possibly get?
We ought to pass the appropriations bills and go to conference and determine how much we'll be spending in the fiscal year that starts October 1st. Hopefully without shutting down the government. If we can't reach agreement, we should pass a CR give them a few more weeks to negotiate. We don't want to see a default on the debt, and we can't be in a position where you turn to a president and say, well, you either stop sending out the Social Security checks or stop making the interest payments on the debt. You decide. We cannot default upon our obligations to pay Social Security checks or our obligations on bonds. We need to spend the amount of money that Congress appropriates, and I realize that Republicans will have a lot to say in making that decision.
Well, Steve Scalise, how much hardball will you play? As I understand it, Mr. Boehner's rule is still in place. Every dollar increase in the debt limit has to have a dollar cut in spending, and that's on top of the sequester. I ask you, will you stay with the Boehner rule? How much hardball will you play regarding the debt limit?
Well, Larry, if you look at the budget that we passed in the House, it actually gets us to balance in 10 years, and it lays out an array of options, the things that it'll take to get us to that balance. And so the president's already been presented with a full menu of items that'll actually get us to balance and get our economy moving again. And ultimately, he's got to be willing to sit at the table. He's got to park Air Force One, stop campaigning. The campaign's over. But ultimately, we've got to start getting control over spending so that we're not borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars each year while the economy suffers. So we've laid out a number of things that can be done to solve this problem. We also said default should not be an option, and the president needs to stop talking about default. Again, President Obama is the only person in town that's threatening default right now. He's got to stop doing that and be constructive. Sit down with us and let's work something out that actually controls spending so we can start living within our means, just like families do.
It's funny. He has said on several occasions, he used the term government shutdown, and he really is the only one. That surprises me, but then again, why am I surprised? Congressman Brad Sherman, thank you very much. Congressman Steve Scalise, thanks.